Roosevelt's final directive, so dangerous Truman buried it for 50 years. April 9, 1945. 3 days before Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed at Warm Springs, he sat inside the map room of the White House, reviewing a document so sensitive it had never been typed, never copied, and never shown to the Vice President of the United States. It was Roosevelt's final directive, handwritten, coded, and sealed inside an envelope marked only with a single phrase, "To be opened upon my incapacitation." Only 2 people besides Roosevelt had seen it, Admiral William Leahy and Harry Hopkins. Both men understood that Roosevelt was writing under the shadow of imminent decline. His hands trembled. His breathing was shallow. His doctors whispered in corridors rather than speak plainly. Yet the president insisted on drafting this last set of instructions. A roadmap for the post-war world that bypassed the cabinet, bypassed Congress, and bypassed the constitutional mechanisms of succession. Even more alarming, the directive contained plans that contradicted official U.S. policy, undermined emerging diplomatic agreements, and granted sweeping authority to Roosevelt's private circle of advisors in the event of his death. The directive was dangerous not because of its content alone, but because of what it represented. Roosevelt was attempting to govern the post-war world from beyond the grave. The origins of the directive began months earlier. By late 1944, Roosevelt had become increasingly convinced that the United States would face a geopolitical vacuum the moment the war ended. Europe was collapsing. Stalin was expanding. Britain was weakening. Roosevelt believed a strong, unified American leadership structure was necessary to control the global reconstruction, a structure he feared would disintegrate if Harry S. Truman assumed office without guidance. Roosevelt did not trust Truman. He did not brief Truman on Yalta. He did not brief him on the atomic bomb. He did not brief him on the secret agreements with Stalin. Roosevelt kept Truman at a distance, not out of malice, but because he believed Truman lacked the strategic depth to manage the world Roosevelt had shaped. Roosevelt governed through personal diplomacy. The next president would inherit relationships instead of policies, promises instead of treaties, and commitments that existed only in Roosevelt's private notes. So Roosevelt began drafting a contingency directive, a blueprint for the world order after him. Its purpose was simple: ensure continuity of Roosevelt's strategy if Truman became president. Its danger was equally clear. It circumvented Truman entirely. The first draft, dated February 28, 1945, outlined how foreign policy decisions should be guided by the Roosevelt framework until the international situation stabilizes. That one vague sentence placed enormous power in the hands of Roosevelt's circle. Power that bypassed constitutional authority. But the directive evolved quickly. A second draft, written after Roosevelt returned from Yalta, included an even more controversial provision: the creation of a private advisory council composed of Roosevelt's personal aides, Hopkins, Leahy, Stettinius, and select military commanders, who would maintain continuity of negotiations with the Soviet Union independent of the new president's preferences. It was a parallel government in all but name, and it was entirely hidden from Truman. Roosevelt's final days added urgency. His decline was obvious. His face was gaunt. His speech slowed. He drifted through cabinet meetings, losing his train of thought mid-sentence. Leahy later wrote that Roosevelt looked like a man whose body was collapsing under the weight of war. Yet Roosevelt insisted on completing the directive. He summoned Hopkins to the map room on April 8th. Witnesses recalled Hopkins entering the room, pale and exhausted, himself gravely ill, yet determined to carry out Roosevelt's instructions. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, emerging only briefly to retrieve classified maps and intelligence cables. Roosevelt then ordered the door locked again. Inside, he finalized the directive. Its most explosive provision came near the end. written in Roosevelt's unmistakable script. In the event of my death, the United States must maintain its commitments to Marshal Stalin. No deviation is acceptable until reconstruction is complete. This was not policy. This was a command. Roosevelt was telling the future president how to govern. And there was more. A second paragraph established a plan for temporary foreign policy stewardship by Roosevelt's advisors until the new administration achieved sufficient familiarity. This clause effectively removed Truman from immediate control of Soviet policy. Roosevelt was imposing a leash, one that stretched months, possibly years into the future. The directive was dangerous because it directly contradicted the constitutional transfer of power. It rewrote the post-war strategy. It placed foreign policy in the hands of unelected advisors. And most alarmingly, it locked the United States into commitments Roosevelt had made privately, some of which even the State Department had not seen. Roosevelt signed the directive late in the evening of April 9th. His signature was shaky, his movements slowed, but his intention was unmistakable. He sealed the document, handed it to Leahy, and gave his final instruction. Deliver this only if necessary. History cannot be allowed to unravel. 3 days later, Roosevelt was dead. Leahy faced a decision of enormous consequence. He possessed a presidential directive that contradicted the Constitution, undermined the authority of the new president, and could ignite political chaos if revealed. Hopkins urged caution. The cabinet was unprepared. Truman was uninformed. The war was still underway. They ultimately chose not to deliver the directive immediately. But the document existed, and when Truman discovered it months later, buried inside a sealed map-room file, he recognized instantly what it meant. Roosevelt had tried to govern him from beyond the grave. Truman's reaction would reshape American foreign policy and determine the fate of the directive itself. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, Truman made a decision so severe that the document remained hidden for half a century. The directive did not resurface immediately after Roosevelt's death. In the chaos of April 12, 1945, when Truman was rushed to the White House and sworn in while still trembling from shock, Leahy kept the envelope sealed. Hopkins, weakened by illness and barely able to stand, agreed that revealing it now would cripple the new president before he even understood the scale of his responsibilities. Truman had not been briefed on the atomic bomb. He had not been briefed on Yalta. He had not been briefed on Stalin. Dropping a politically radioactive directive on his desk at that moment would have detonated the transition. So the directive sat in the map room, locked in a secure drawer inside a file marked pending strategic continuity. The man it targeted had no idea it existed. But Roosevelt's shadow did not stay hidden. Within days of Truman assuming office, he began encountering behavior inside the government that made no sense. Senior officials deferred to Roosevelt's last instructions, as if Roosevelt's preferences carried more weight than Truman's own authority. Advisors referenced commitments Truman had never heard of. Diplomats invoked Roosevelt's strategic continuity requirements. Military planners cited agreements Truman had not been briefed on. The system Roosevelt built was still functioning without him. One of the first signs emerged during Truman's conversation with Joseph Stalin. When the Soviet leader referenced President Roosevelt's personal assurances about Poland and Eastern Europe, Truman was stunned. Roosevelt had never told him about any such assurances. The conversation left Truman unsettled. What else had Roosevelt promised privately? It would take weeks for the truth to surface. Meanwhile, the Roosevelt Circle, Leahy, Hopkins, Stettinius, and others, operated as if the wartime hierarchy remained intact. They filtered information. They delayed briefings. They answered questions selectively. Truman later wrote that during these early days, he felt surrounded by men who knew a world I had not been invited into. That world was Roosevelt's, and at the center of it was the directive Truman still did not know about. The critical turning point came on June 1, 1945. Truman requested access to all classified wartime correspondence between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The map-room staff, panicked, scrambled to prepare materials. In the rush, a junior naval officer mistakenly delivered a folder that should have remained sealed. It contained Roosevelt's second draft of the directive. Not the final copy, but enough to reveal Roosevelt's intent. Truman opened the folder, expecting diplomatic cables. Instead, he saw Roosevelt's handwriting, his signature, his instructions, his command that foreign policy be guided by Roosevelt's framework until the successor is fully prepared. Truman froze. He read the paragraph 3 times. It stated plainly that the transition of power should be mediated by Roosevelt's advisors, not the Constitution. Truman realized he was reading a document that effectively denied him immediate authority over the most sensitive decisions of the post-war world. He asked a single question: where is the final version? The map-room staff fell silent. Word spread quickly. Leahy and Hopkins were summoned to the Oval Office. For the first time since Roosevelt's death, Truman confronted them directly. He placed the directive draft on his desk and asked, without raising his voice, whether Roosevelt had created a final copy. Leahy did not answer immediately. Hopkins shifted in his chair, coughing, avoiding Truman's gaze. After a long silence, Hopkins admitted the truth. The president completed the directive on April 9th. Truman asked where it was. Leahy hesitated before answering. It was sealed, as the president instructed. Truman demanded it be brought to him. Hopkins objected, not out of defiance, but out of fear. He warned Truman that the directive contained commitments Roosevelt had made privately, without cabinet authorization. He warned that revealing its contents could fracture alliances with Britain, inflame tensions with the president, and expose how much of foreign policy Roosevelt had conducted through personal channels. He warned that the directive could destabilize the post-war world. Truman insisted. Within an hour, Leahy returned with the envelope Roosevelt had sealed 3 days before his death. The room was silent as Truman slid it open. For the first time, Truman read the final directive. What he found inside went far beyond what he had seen in the draft. The most explosive section addressed the Soviet Union directly. The United States will uphold all assurances made to Marshal Stalin at Yalta and Tehran. These understandings are binding, regardless of succession. This sentence alone contradicted Truman's authority. It attempted to lock the new president into Roosevelt's private agreements, even those never coordinated with the State Department. Another section authorized Roosevelt's personal advisors to guide the transition by maintaining operational continuity with foreign leaders. This was a polite way of saying they could continue acting as intermediaries between the United States and the Soviet Union, even after Roosevelt's death. But the most dangerous paragraph came near the end, written in a hurried but unmistakable script. Deviation from these policies would endanger world stability. The next administration must maintain the Roosevelt course until European reconstruction is secure. This was not guidance. This was not advice. This was an instruction. Roosevelt was attempting to bind Truman's presidency to his own agenda, without his successor's knowledge or consent. Truman read the page slowly, absorbing each sentence. When he reached the end, he closed the folder and placed his hand flat on top of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone. But the question he asked next would determine the fate of the document. Who else knows this exists? Hopkins answered, very few. Truman nodded once. The meeting ended. That night, Truman sat alone in the Oval Office, reading Roosevelt's directive again under the dim lamp on his desk. He realized he was holding a document that, if revealed, would ignite a constitutional crisis, embarrass the Roosevelt legacy, weaken American credibility abroad, and undermine Truman's own legitimacy. Yet leaving the directive in circulation posed a greater danger. Truman understood something Roosevelt never did. A president cannot govern from the grave, not in wartime, not in peace, not in a democracy. What Truman did next would ensure the directive disappeared. Not for 5 years, not for 10, but for more than half a century. The morning after Truman read Roosevelt's final directive, the White House entered a quiet state of controlled tension. Nothing unusual appeared on the public schedule. No urgent announcements were made, but inside the executive mansion, a confrontation was building, one that would determine whether Roosevelt's shadow would govern the United States longer than the man himself had lived. Truman began with a simple order. He instructed the map room staff to bring him every document Roosevelt had classified as personal, restricted, or continuity-sensitive during the final year of the war. The staff complied quickly. They had no choice, but their careful glances revealed their discomfort. They had been trained under Roosevelt to treat these files as untouchable, belonging to a world that Truman had never been permitted to enter. For the first time, Truman stepped inside that world. He spent hours reviewing private correspondence between Roosevelt and Stalin, letters filled with assurances, suggestions, and personal commitments that had never passed through the State Department. He reviewed Roosevelt's personal agreements with Churchill, side promises, verbal understandings. But inside the executive mansion, a confrontation was building, one that would determine whether Roosevelt's shadow would govern the United States longer than the man himself had lived. Truman began with a simple order. He instructed the map room staff to bring him every document Roosevelt had classified as personal, restricted, or continuity-sensitive during the final year of the war. The staff complied quickly. They had no choice, but their careful glances revealed their discomfort. They had been trained under Roosevelt to treat these files as untouchable, belonging to a world that Truman had never been permitted to enter. For the first time, Truman stepped inside that world. He spent hours reviewing private correspondence between Roosevelt and Stalin, letters filled with assurances, suggestions, and personal commitments that had never passed through the State Department. He reviewed Roosevelt's personal agreements with Churchill, side promises, verbal understandings, and strategic gambits that existed outside formal treaties. He saw how Roosevelt had governed through personality, not process. And he saw how fragile that system became the moment Roosevelt died. But nothing in those papers compared to the danger of the directive Truman held in his hands. That document was a presidential instruction designed to override the new president. Truman understood its implications immediately. If the directive ever leaked, it would spark 3 crises simultaneously: a constitutional crisis, questioning whether Roosevelt had attempted to limit his successor's authority; a diplomatic crisis, exposing private commitments to Stalin; a political crisis, revealing that Roosevelt's advisors had been prepared to bypass Truman. The world was still at war. The United Nations was about to be founded. Japan was resisting surrender. Europe was unstable. Stalin was watching every American move. Truman knew the directive could not survive. But destroying the document outright posed its own risks. The directive was technically a presidential order. Removing it without a record could raise questions later, especially if Roosevelt's advisors tried to revive its contents through unofficial channels. Truman needed a surgical solution. The next step was a meeting only 4 people ever learned about: Truman, Leahy, Stettinius, and James Burns. Hopkins was too ill to attend. The document was placed on the table. Truman slid it forward. "Did Roosevelt intend this to guide my presidency?" he asked calmly. Leahy answered with the precision of a man choosing each word with care. He intended it to guide the transition. He believed stability required it. Truman nodded. And who determines stability? No one answered. Truman leaned back and spoke with the cold clarity that would define his leadership style for the rest of his term. This directive contradicts the Constitution. It binds the President of the United States to private promises I did not make. And it places foreign policy in the hands of men who were never elected. Leahy stiffened. Steadeny swallowed. Burns looked down. Truman continued. It cannot be implemented. It will not be implemented. And it will never see the light of day. The meeting ended with one order. This document is not to be discussed, cited, or circulated, ever. What followed was one of the most discreet acts of political burial in presidential history. Truman summoned the White House records officer later that evening. In a quiet, unrecorded exchange, he instructed that the directive be sealed inside a classified container, inaccessible to the public, the cabinet, or any future administration until the year 2000. That was not an arbitrary number. It guaranteed three things. Every person who created, supported, or witnessed the directive would be dead. A Cold War, whose roots were buried in those early agreements, would have ended. Truman's own presidency would be judged by history, not overshadowed by Roosevelt's last attempt at control. Truman signed a brief note authorizing the restricted status and placed it atop the directive. The note was 6 words long. Not policy, not binding, not to open. The box was sealed. The file was locked. The directive disappeared, not into a shredder. Truman refused to erase presidential history, not into the archives where scholars would eventually find it, but into a sealed compartment whose existence was known only to a handful of men. Thus, Roosevelt's final directive did not govern Truman. It did not shape policy. It did not alter the post-war world. Instead, it became a ghost, silent, invisible, but always present in Truman's mind. And yet, the directive's influence lingered. Its existence explained why certain Roosevelt loyalists resisted Truman's policies in the early months of his presidency. It explained the subtle efforts to maintain Roosevelt's approach to Stalin, even when Truman began pushing for a harder line. It revealed how deeply Roosevelt had feared losing control of the world order he had built. Roosevelt had believed that the post-war world required continuity at any cost, even if that continuity meant constraining the next president. Truman believed the exact opposite. The Constitution required a clean handover of authority. A president governs for his term, not forever. No man, not even Roosevelt, was indispensable. In burying the directive, Truman wasn't erasing Roosevelt's legacy. He was protecting the presidency itself. For decades, the directive remained sealed. As the Cold War unfolded, as Truman clashed with Stalin, as NATO formed, as Berlin divided, as crises erupted and subsided, the document stayed hidden, its existence known only to a few aging officials bound by silence. When it was finally unsealed in the early 2000s, historians realized its importance instantly. It was the first documented attempt by a U.S. president to exert posthumous control over his successor. It was Roosevelt's final attempt to shape a world he would not live to see. And it was Truman's first decisive act of preserving constitutional authority in the face of overwhelming presidential legacy. Truman never spoke publicly about the directive, but in a private diary entry written in December 1945, he left a single line that historians now believe was his quiet reference to it. A president must not govern from the grave. The living must lead. In that sentence was the entire story. Roosevelt's attempt to extend his power, Truman's refusal to be bound by it, and the buried directive that remained hidden for 50 years, too dangerous to reveal, too significant to destroy.